There comes a time when you see something so filled with inaccuracies, riddled with logical fallacies, and cozily sprinkled with lies, that it is impossible to look away. It's been at least a few days since I've seen a video as intellectually dishonest as Mr. Beat's Systemic Racism Explained. This video is moderately well researched from a historical point of view, but its actual message is unfortunately so mired in falsehoods that we were compelled to make a video about it. We found this gem while researching my last video about positive discrimination, so it's a bit of a follow-up. I just want to preface this by saying Mr. Beat actually has some great videos and he's a great content creator, but this video, well, it had some issues. You may ask, why would you continue to make videos on race and disparities? People don't like to hear this stuff. They hate reckless reforms. Racism is one of those topics that is nearly impossible to find honest evaluations of. The subject is so filled with emotion, rhetoric, and lies that unfortunately many people have a completely backwards or simply confused idea of the subject. It's not our fault though. Multiple decades of propaganda, race hustlers, and academic leaders lying to us will do that to people. Which of course you can learn all about because you can read books from Amazon to learn about anything you're interested in. Sometimes I have trouble finding books for inspiration, and that's why it's great to have a full library to choose from at Amazon. You can browse through thousands of awesome books on economic history and much more. Learn from great authors about how the world works and all those interesting topics you've been wanting to do a deep dive on. Depending on your preferences, you can pick between Kindle, paperback, hardcover, and Audible. There's a lot of great deals up right now, so scroll down, click the link below, and check out all the great options available. Anyways, let's jump right in. One of the first things that really caught my attention when listening to this video is how, when Mr. Beat was young, he remembered how certain people got scholarships simply because of their race. He remembered it as being uncomfortable and confusing for him, even going so far as to think it was kind of racist. And he took the time to define racism for us, and thankfully he was right on the money, which we already know it from the American Heritage Dictionary as the belief that humans can be divided into so-called biological groups called races, and that certain races are inferior or superior to other races. And he gives a definition of systemic racism as well, when a group of people has less opportunities because of entire systems being racist. However, this is where things veer right into La La Land. He claims that people with lighter skin have historically had a huge advantage around the world, without explaining why, or what part of history specifically, because this is actually simply not true. He also claims that minority groups often needed special treatment to even get a fair chance in life, which there isn't much evidence at all that special treatment has helped any of these groups, with much of the evidence pointing in the opposite direction.
Well, crap!
These are the first reasons he gives that justify quote, positive discrimination, in his opinion, to help minorities rise up to the social position that white people and Asians are in. He also claims these people are wrong when they say,
the United States does not have systemic racism.
There is no such thing as systemic racism. Stop feeling guilty. It doesn't exist.
I think there's individual racism, but the idea that there's widespread systemic racism does not exist.
There's no systemic racism in this country. Dr. King eliminated that with the Voting Rights Act, the Civil Rights Act, and the Fair Housing Act.
Systemic racism does not exist. There are no laws in America, meaning the system. Doesn't mean racism doesn't exist. Racism exists. There are people who are racist, and you should do everything you can to show them that their ideas are wrong, and that you should not be judging someone based on their race, of course. But the idea that there is systemic racism, meaning that there are laws in place that treat black people differently, or Asian people differently, or white people differently, simply doesn't exist.
It's not.
Laws in place that treat black people differently, or Asian people differently, or white people differently.
No, the laws are pretty much fine.
However, there is more than one definition of systemic racism or institutional racism, like this one from the Cambridge Dictionary. Policies and practices that exist throughout a whole society or organization and that result in and support a continued unfair advantage to some people and unfair or harmful treatment of others based on race. Sounds a little bit like affirmative action. So, because it doesn't fit his singular vague definition, he's somehow able to say that systemic racism is still a huge problem, and that the laws are pretty much fine, which is a little confusing because he actually talks later about how the laws are not fine, so this is going to happen a lot. Okay, so what can the government do about quote-unquote systemic racism if it's not the laws that are creating it? Which, by the way, that's exactly what systemic racism is, at least partly. His definition was simply more vague than the other, so he was able to use that inherent fuzziness to add to his point. Anyways, he says,
it's the enforcement of the law. See, that's an example of how the criminal justice system has been racist.
Which I guess means that the people enforcing the laws are racist and not actually the system, because the system is influenced by the laws, right? Especially if we're talking about the criminal justice system. It's either the people or the laws, which is so confusing because I thought we were talking about how the system was racist. The way the system is set up, or the instructions on how to carry out the system, that would usually be considered systemic racism. He then says that because of this,
unfortunately, systemic racism is indeed real. And to prove it, I'm going to give you the most common examples of it. Here are 6 examples of systemic racism.
And he fires up the equity fallacy roller coaster that we all came here for. He prefaces his 6 points by saying that some people, often minorities, start in a different place than white Americans.
Some of us have to first climb out of a hole first to even get to the ground.
And he even adds an animation of a white person kicking dirt on a black person in this hole that the black guy is in.
Sometimes some of the people on the ground even kick dirt back in this hole on the people down there.
I'm wondering what this is representing. Like, where are the statistics that show there are a large group of regular white people who are just purposely trying to make it harder for darker skinned people? He gives no explanation of this. He just moves right past that claim as if it was a known fact, and of course leaves the burden of proof on us. So Mr. Beat has moved the goalpost to describe what is and is not systemically racist to mean disparities equal racism. Then he goes on to say that the healthcare, education, employment, home ownership, political, and criminal justice systems are all systemically racist, so basically everything is racist. This is because of disparities, and you guessed it, only disparities. Not once does he offer any proof that there is a conspiracy to put black people down, as he is suggesting. Not once does he prove that this is something that the US government could actually fix. And he even says,
and notice how poverty underlies all of them.
With this in mind, let's take a look at his 6 points that prove without a doubt that systemic racism exists.
The healthcare system has hurt people of color more than others. People of color are less likely to be in good health. The life expectancy for black men is more than 4 years less than that of white men. People of color are less likely to see a doctor. They are less likely to have good health insurance or health insurance at all. During the COVID-19 pandemic, people of color died from the virus at a higher rate than whites. People of color are less likely to be vaccinated. They are less likely to get treatment for mental illness. Black infants are more than 2 times as likely to die as white infants. Black and Hispanic children are more than twice as likely to not have enough food to eat than white children. Black women are 3 to 4 times more likely to die from pregnancy-related causes than white women.
These disparities are not because black people are denied health care because of their race. And Mr. Beat knows this. As he said himself, this is because of poverty. Poor people do not eat as well as more affluent people, and they're more depressed, they don't go to the doctor as much, and they do not get as much prenatal care. He does not provide an answer as to how this is because of systemic racism. He just says it's because of poverty and places the burden of proof on us.
The education system has hurt people of color more than others. Students of color generally have less educational opportunities. They generally do worse on standardized tests. They're less likely to graduate from high school or go to college. When they do go to college, the colleges are lower quality. Black college students owe around $7,000 more in student loan debt than white college students.
Once again, he provides these disparities and does not prove whether or not this is because of systemic racism. He claims most of this has to do with poverty, and he would be right. And yes, poor people are usually the ones who owe more in student loans because they either did not pay off their college with their own money, or because they can't make enough money to pay off their student loans.
Students of color have less access to advanced classes. There's evidence that non-black teachers set lower expectations for black students.
Non-black teachers, which is most teachers expect less out of black students, which obviously is a product of affirmative action, which he is basically arguing for here.
They are 54% less likely than white students to get recommended for gifted classes.
They are also not in advanced classes as much because they do not do as well in school.
Schools are highly segregated by skin color. Most schools, where the majority are students of color, are in the inner cities and slums.
And they are segregated because people purposefully segregate themselves into communities of their own color. It's not like there are a bunch of black people clamoring to get into white neighborhoods and they are rejected or something.
Because most public schools are funded primarily through property taxes, schools where the majority are students of color are often underfunded compared to majority white schools.
The fact is, most majority black neighborhoods make less money. Schools are funded by the neighborhoods they are in. And as a matter of fact, many of the schools that spend the most per student have some of the worst results from its students.
The employment system has hurt people of color more than others. Then again, a lot of this is related to the education system. People of color are more likely to be unemployed. They tend to get less job opportunities and worse benefits. In the United States, blacks earn 30% less than whites. The median household income of African Americans is about 1/8 that of the median household income of whites. Blacks are underrepresented in high-paying professions.
There are multiple reasons why an employer would not hire black people over white people, and none of them have to do with race. Most of it has to do with the system that we've set up. One of them is because of affirmative action. Employers know how that works and take it into account. There are also often differences in work performance shown in many studies. Black people also tend to be interested in different subjects compared to white people and Asians, and sometimes that means they're interested in lower paying jobs.
On average, African-American entrepreneurs get $35,000 in loans to start a business versus the $107,000 that whites get.
I don't know if he's saying banks are racist or classist here, but he doesn't offer any proof. But this is clearly not because they're discriminating against black people. It's most likely because of poverty.
The housing system has hurt people of color more than others. People of color are much less likely to own a house and much more likely to spend a higher percentage of their income on rent. They have a harder time getting loans to buy homes. When they do get loans, they tend to pay higher interest rates. The black home ownership rate is 44%.
For whites, it's 74%.
People of color generally live in smaller homes. They generally live in less safe neighborhoods, strongly related to the fact that these neighborhoods have concentrated poverty.
So because of the housing system, as if it wasn't a mostly free market system, black people don't own houses as much as whites, which, yeah, if you're more poor, then you won't be able to afford a house or be able to get a good loan. The whole redlining thing is really just a product of banks trying to cover their ass. If you're applying for a mortgage with a bad salary and you want to buy a house in a dangerous area, you won't be able to get as good a loan because those factors increase the risk that the bank is taking on to give you the loan. You are more likely to be robbed, your car stolen, your house vandalized, and to generally just die in a bad neighborhood, and that is all taken into account when someone is choosing whether or not to give you a loan. And if they aren't taking that into account, they're not doing their job very well, because all of those things affect whether or not you can pay them back. He also mentions later that affordable housing only helped whites in the 1930s, and that the affordable housing regulation itself pushed blacks into public housing slums, which is true, but kind of confusing because quote-unquote affordable housing also includes public housing. They are often made for the same purpose. Also, what do you think public housing is supposed to be? Luxury apartments? They're always slums. That's why public housing is a terrible idea. He also mentions eminent domain kicking blacks out of their homes, which obviously, yes, it did that, but it did that to literally all poor people. They didn't just do it to oppress blacks. They go for the cheapest land usually. They're not going to pay extra for the land if they don't have to. The taxpayers probably wouldn't like that. This is not to say that institutional racism didn't exist during these times, as it did, but the fact is, when these things happened later, like after the Civil Rights Act, it was not likely about race and more likely about the incentives of the market and government agencies. He could attempt to prove otherwise, but he doesn't.
Here in the United States, the political system has hurt people of color more than others. People of color have more obstacles to voting. In 2016, 1 out of every 13 African Americans couldn't vote due to a felony conviction compared to 1 out of 56 white Americans. People of color are more likely to have to wait in line to vote. They're more likely to have trouble finding their polling location and finding a time to vote. They're less likely to have an ID to vote.
This is an interesting one. Mr. Beat says that because black people commit more crimes, they don't have IDs as often and they live in poor neighborhoods. That means that the political system is systemically racist. Yes, we shouldn't take away felons' right to vote, but that's how it works for all of the felons. So it's obviously not systemic racism. There are always less polls in poor neighborhoods, so that's not surprising. Also, the political system is clearly becoming more saturated with minority groups as more and more minorities and blacks in particular are being accepted as city, state, and federal leaders. There has literally never been this proportion of minorities in American politics, with white people literally showing how unracist they are with their votes. You cannot get elected without the white demographics vote in most places in the US. There are just too many of them.
As I already mentioned, the criminal justice system has hurt people of color more than others. There's no evidence whatsoever that people of color use or sell drugs at a higher rate than whites. Yet, they get arrested much more and then get harsher prison sentences.
Mr. Beat thinks that because black people are more often criminals per capita, that the criminal justice system is systemically racist. Black people do commit more crime. The statistics are not skewed. Every crime statistic will back that up.
Black males get federal sentences around 20% longer than white males for the exact same crime.
There is a reason black people often get longer prison sentences than white people, and it's actually super simple. If you have a prior conviction, you are more likely to get a higher prison sentence. Most statistics won't control for whether or not the person being arrested had committed crimes as a minor or had committed previous crimes at all.
Color are more likely to get stopped and frisked and harassed by police officers. In the United States, blacks are between 2 to 4 times more likely to be killed by police than white people. Do blacks commit more crimes in the United States? Well, they get arrested more, is all we know. Keep in mind that the majority of arrests are drug-related. Now, do blacks commit more violent crimes? According to the data, yes, but that data is often insufficient and misleading.
Is it though? I mean, like, what data are you using? Like, most data comes from the FBI, some kind of criminal justice system database. I mean, to be honest, the only way that you could say this is that police are just arresting the wrong people. That does happen, but it's not nearly at the rate that this would have to be. So basically, all of the issues he mentioned here can be easily explained by this group committing more crime. To say it is systemic racism is simply denying that they do. At the end of these 6 points, he even shows the opposition point of view and impulsively says poverty equals racism.
Disparities do not mean systemic racism. Disparities mean disparities.
But what caused those disparities?
A black married man has the same unemployment rate as do whites. What is stopping a black person from going to college or university?
Poverty?
The things that you mentioned are disparities. Tell me how these disparities are because of racism.
Poverty.
You mentioned mortgage applications. It is true that blacks are turned down at a higher rate for mortgages than whites. It's also true that Asians are turned down less often than whites. How do you explain that?
Generational poverty caused by systemic racism. Again, poverty underlies all of these.
That was a serious point. Do racists just ignore married black people, or are you just trying to make noise over this man to drown out the crystal clear logic? This is exhausting, honestly. Why does poverty equal racism? Where is the evidence that the only reason that a group is poor is because it is being discriminated against? I'll give you a hint. He doesn't tell you. As a matter of fact, he even sort of admits that poverty does not equal racism right here.
And yeah, we must recognize that there's a lot of white folks in poverty as well, including much of my own family. This is why I think the term white privilege does more harm than good, raising awareness about systemic racism, as it tends to downplay the experiences of poor white folks. In reality, we could just as easily call it wealth privilege instead of white privilege.
And then he moves the goalpost again, saying, you know what, it's not actually current racism that's the problem, it's previous racism.
So what caused these 6 examples of systemic racism? The momentum of history.
However, there is no good evidence that previously oppressed people will always have long-lasting negative effects. There are so many examples of discriminated people who came to countries with nothing to their name, facing incredible discrimination, becoming more affluent, more represented, and more educated than even the majority groups within the countries they moved to. In Southeast Asia, including Malaysia, Vietnam, Thailand, and the Philippines, the Chinese have borne the brunt of illegal and legalized discrimination in life, employment, education, land ownership, residence, and politics. In Malaysia, this Chinese discrimination is literally written into their constitution, giving Malays preferential treatment through government quotas and everything from politics to education. Arguably, the racism in Malaysia has been worse than in the United States. For example, let's take a look at lynchings. In America, the most amount of black Americans lynched in a single year was 161 in 1892. That's a lot. But when we look at a lot of other countries, this number probably would be close to the bottom of the list. In Southeast Asia, the amount of Chinese killed or lynched in a single day in 1969 exceeded 3 or 4 times the amount of all the blacks lynched in that entire year in the United States. In 1998, in Indonesia, it reached about 6 times that of 1892 in the US in less than 2 weeks, over 100 years later. This kind of hatred is no joke and has obviously led to worse consequences than American hatred of blacks during the first half of the 20th century, considering many of the people who experienced this and continue to deal with it are very much alive and some relatively young. With all of this blatant discrimination continuing to this day, the average Chinese Malay still earns 50% more than the average Malay. Throughout this area, the Chinese own most of the investments in multiple industries. By the mid-20th century, they owned 3/4 of the rice mills in the Philippines and about 85% of them in Thailand. They also carried out over 70% of the retail trade across most of Southeast Asia, and this is actually a pretty common trope throughout history. The Japanese are another great example in the United States. They were even imprisoned in California in 1942 with all of their belongings stolen and property sold off, having literally nothing when they were released and no family back home in Japan to help. The immigrants from war-torn Japan with nothing to their name also added to the numbers of destitute Japanese in the country. This did not stop the Japanese, who often did not speak English and endured massive amounts of daily racism from many Americans. After all this, by 1969, Japanese families were earning about a third more than the average American family. It wasn't until 1988, well after they had exceeded the average American income and prosperity, that Ronald Reagan signed the Civil Liberties Act, officially apologizing and giving a paltry $20,000 to each of those who were interned as reparations. Some other fine examples of people who have been legally discriminated against and remained as top earners are the Jews, who have been ruthlessly discriminated against in Europe and the Levant for thousands of years. Also, there's the East Indians in Africa and Southeast Asia, the Italians in Argentina, and the Armenians in the Middle East, Africa, and the US, who also endured a racially motivated genocide at the hands of the Ottoman Turks and still came out on top. And there are still a bunch more. Why did these persistently discriminated against people do so much better than the majorities of the people in so many of these countries? Well, most often it came down to a culture that prioritized hard work, family, education, and often a gravitation towards so-called middleman jobs that, for thousands of years, have been considered evil or shameful jobs. For example, some Catholics didn't want to do banking jobs because of Catholic laws against usury, or charging interest on loans, so Jews often took their place. Family is one of the most important cultural aspects that predicts the success of an ethnic group, as well as the age at which people are married, and the age at which people have kids, which are all different between ethnic groups.
And finally, there's the single-parent household distinction. 84% of Asian American and Pacific Islander children live with two parents. However, just 58% of Hispanic or Latino children, 51% of Native American children, and 36% of African American children live with two parents.
Single motherhood is one of the largest indicators of whether a child will get in trouble with the law, get educated, be mentally healthy, or become generally financially successful in life, and unfortunately, single motherhood in America is highest in Black families. A lot of evidence points towards the policies designed to help Black people out of poverty as being the reason for many of their issues today. Much of the civil rights legislation was necessary and good, including policies that equalized everyone's rights and opportunities under the law. However, the disparities continued and often began to get wider after some of the policies that were created during the civil rights movement. Before the Civil Rights Act, blacks made the most progress than they have in all of American history. Between the 1920s and 1964, black professional, technical, administrative, and generally higher-level positions rose and then suddenly fell along with the black family income after the Civil Rights Act and continued to stagnate into the late 1970s. Black single motherhood also continued to skyrocket from about 30% in the 1960s to over 70% today, mostly caused by the welfare programs of the 1960s that essentially married black women to the state, incentivizing women to be single mothers or to give up state welfare when marrying a man. These changes for the worse all took place during a time that we expected to be a renaissance of progress for oppressed minorities. Mr. Beat claims that the high single motherhood is because all the black fathers are in prison.
More often than not, single-parent households in the United States are missing a father at home. And where might the fathers be? Well, likely they're in prison as non-violent drug offenders.
Which, no. First of all, that would be
absolutely
insane.
That would mean that, 10 million people would be in jail as drug offenders. 13.6% of the US population is black. That's about 45 million people. There are about 1.2 million prisoners in America, and 38% of them are black. That means there are about 456,000 black people in prison, about 1% of the black population. Also, by the age of 40, about 26% of black men have been to prison, which is the highest in the country, but it doesn't make up for the 72% of black single mothers over the entire lives of their children. Also, when you go to prison for drugs, you don't go for that long. With people being put away for many years only superficially because of drugs, it's usually because they have pleaded down to the charge from some other heinous crime they have committed, like robbery for example, which does not get put on the person's record after the trial. So it's not like that quarter of 40-year-old black men are still in prison. Only a very small minority are. That gives them plenty of time to be fathers. Drug criminality is another thing that affects black people disproportionately, and he introduces this fact by explaining the difference in sentencing for crack cocaine and powder cocaine.
Reagan signed the Anti-Drug Act of 1986, which created a minimum prison sentence of 10 years for anyone found distributing 50 grams of crack cocaine or 5,000 grams of powder cocaine.
Why just 50 grams of crack cocaine versus the 5,000 of powder cocaine? Well, because it was mostly people of color, poor people in the slums that were the ones doing crack cocaine, because it was cheaper than powdered cocaine. Rich people were doing powdered cocaine just as much as the poor people were doing crack cocaine. They're all doing cocaine, but they had to get the poor people. They had to put the poor people and the people of color in prison.
Look, this law is ridiculous. I agree. Most drugs probably shouldn't even be illegal, but it's still not racist, even if you could prove it was passed for racist reasons. The law affects anyone who gets caught with crack. If a random white guy was caught with it, he would also be sentenced harshly. Also, it's not like crack is a culturally important drug for African Americans or something, like khat is for Ethiopians and Somalis. Honestly, if any drug ban is xenophobic or something, it's the ban on khat. Okay, US government, legalize it. Just to take this point home, if we made it illegal for black people to play basketball, that would be a racist law. However, if we made it illegal for everyone to play basketball, that would not be racist. even though it would disproportionately affect black athletes. As a matter of fact, all laws disproportionately affect black people because they commit more crime.
At least more violent crime.
If we took this logic to its absolute extreme, we would need to get rid of all of the laws to make the system less racist, which I'm sure many people would be totally on board with. Mr. Beat also claims that 50% of all wealth is inherited.
According to the economist Thomas Piketty, most wealth, more than 70% of it, is inherited, not earned. Other economists dispute how he came up with that figure.
Okay, so this kind of shows exactly where Mr. Beat stands. Thomas Piketty is a socialist, so he's obviously not a very good economist. I'm kind of joking, but still, it's pretty obvious from that this is not going to be a fact-based argument. That number is for the ultra-wealthy. It's more like 30%. Most people aren't out here just inheriting it up. The bottom line is wealth is usually created. It's most often not inherited. This is also super misleading because he's talking about half of all wealth in the entire world, but a lot of the world is not capitalist or a free market, so it doesn't really help his point. He also mentions racial gerrymandering, claiming it is still happening to a great extent.
Racial gerrymandering, or manipulating districts to weaken the black vote, became more common.
However, the fact that one racial group or another is affected by this does not automatically make the motivation racist. Gerrymandering is almost exclusively done to suppress opposition political beliefs, not necessarily just one racial demographic. That wouldn't be nearly as effective as, for example, making it easier for Republicans to win than Democrats. The racial approach in this case would assume that Republicans are only white and Democrats are only black, which, nope. Also, Republicans and Democrats both gerrymander. Just because one group does it and it affects a specific racial group more does not mean it's because of racism. This is just a simple correlation fallacy, and it assumes that the Democrat Party is the quote-unquote party of the blacks, which is super sneaky. This is similar to his claim that black communities will be given shorter hours to vote to quote-unquote stop voter fraud.
Not only that, but voting locations and times were reduced to weaken the vote of people of color. And all of this was in the name of supposedly fighting voter fraud. Right.
Which this tactic has been used in multiple communities, not just black communities. Once again, this is most likely used to suppress the vote of one political party or another, not necessarily about the black vote. Or maybe it's actually about voter fraud. Who knows? It's not like Mr. Beat is going to offer any evidence. That's really the issue with these claims. There is no actual evidence for it being racially motivated. He also says people of color would simply be unregistered to vote and be sent away.
As did undoing voter registrations and making it more difficult to register to vote. People of color would often show up to vote and find out that they were no longer registered to vote and then sent away.
Which, what are we doing here, man? This has happened to people in tons of communities. It's not just black people that this happens to. We're talking about inefficient local governments all across America. It happens every year to people all over the country. There are tons of reasons people get deregistered, and I assume it happens way more in poor neighborhoods, which obviously means people of color will be affected more. Honestly, these are just straight up conspiracies at this point. And apparently segregation still exists. It doesn't, by the way. People naturally segregate themselves into their own communities.
Segregation by skin color is worse today than it was in 1990, even though it's no longer written into laws, folks.
And by the way, it wasn't written into laws in the 1990s either. It's been happening for literally thousands of years without any government intervention. When the Italians came to America, they built their own little communities. So did the Irish, the Jews, the Chinese, the Vietnamese, the Koreans, the Germans. Like, literally everybody. Most people would agree that Little Italy and Koreatown aren't purely examples of systemic racism, regardless of the socioeconomic differences in these places. Maybe partly because of individual racism between groups, but not systemic racism. The fact is, black people want to live around other black people just as much or more than pretty much any other race. He goes a little bit into his own story here, and he even says here that he himself experienced racism.
In 2010, when I couldn't find a teaching job because of the recession, I substitute taught here. And back then, nearly every kid that went to school here was in poverty too. Often, I was the only white guy in the building. In fact, this is the first time in my life that I remember
actually experiencing racism firsthand, meaning people were racist towards me. And I remember thinking, oh, so that's what it's like to be judged by the color of your skin. This sucks.
This is a refreshing turn, as he is validating that it doesn't feel good for anybody to be hated for the color of their skin, and that it is indeed racist to hate a white person for their skin color. However, he does add that culture has nothing to do with the way black people act, and that it is 100% because of poverty, which in his opinion is 100% because of institutional racism. This is obviously insane to say. That's like saying white people don't act like white people because of their culture, but because they are rich and privileged, which obviously most of them aren't. He again goes on to impulsively say poverty, but this time over Ben Shapiro's questions.
Because it has nothing to do with race and everything to do with culture. And when you have a culture that doesn't... You know what? Explain to me. You explain to me why black kids aren't graduating high school.
Poverty?
Explain to me why black kids are shooting each other in rates significantly higher
Poverty.
than whites are shooting each other. Explain to me why 13% of the population is responsible for 50% of the murder. Explain
Poverty.
Why the number of black kids in prison, not for innocent reasons, not for walking down the street and getting pulled into a prison, is so high.
Oh, yeah,
Explain,
poverty.
It has nothing to do with culture. Explain to me why the single motherhood rate in the black community jumped from 20% to 70%.
Oh, that one's actually the drug war.
Movement has made such tremendous
Poverty.
strides.
All those statistics that he lists off are symptoms, not causes. The root cause is poverty. And again, that poverty is caused by the momentum of history. Also, folks conveniently leave out the fact that most of that is due to gang violence, and gang violence is rooted in, you guessed it, poverty.
This, once again, is not the reason why black people commit more murders. There are more poor white people than there are poor black people in the US, and poor whites still do not murder at the same rate. He even says that a big reason why there are more black people committing murder is because of gang violence. Well, what do you think a gang structure is built off of? It's a criminal culture that influences the members to commit crimes. Gangs always have and always will have a large cultural element to them, and are most often based on ethnic groups with similar or the same cultural backgrounds. That's literally the primary way they judge new members. Admitting that the murders are a result of ethnic gangs and turning around and saying culture isn't a part of the issue is like saying, oh yes, terrorist acts are a result of radical terrorist groups, but it has nothing to do with their dogmatic religious beliefs. It's only because they're poor. I mean, honestly, the amount of mental gymnastics here is truly dizzying. How many poor people do you know that kill just because they're poor? The only reason someone commits a crime like that is because they're either psychotic, brainwashed, or they feel justified. If you think murdering people is a justified way to solve your issues, you should spend 20 to life in a cell reflecting on that. Anyways, he doubles down on the legacy of discrimination thing, saying that it's actually not just regular old discrimination that created the disparities, but property rights discrimination specifically. Once again, moving the goalpost. I don't even know why at this point.
How do you explain that Chinese Americans who were victimized by racism, how do you explain that they have a higher net income than do whites? How do you explain that Japanese Americans have a higher household income than do whites? How do you explain that Korean Americans have a higher net income than do whites? How do you explain Nigerian Americans have a higher net income, household income than do whites?
I'm glad you brought that up because the vast majority of Chinese, Japanese, Korean, Nigerian, and Indian immigrants, while we're at it, all mostly came to the United States since the 1960s, not before it. Also, of all people of color, it's only mostly African Americans and Native Americans that have faced systemic racism with regards to property rights in the past.
This is simply not true. A huge amount of Chinese people came in the 1800s. Also, most Japanese immigrants came between the late 1800s and the early 1900s, so it makes sense why he didn't include them. And as we saw, they had their property rights taken away and they were imprisoned in the 1940s. But either way, he's effectively made this so incredibly confusing that it's impossible to know who's being discriminated against and who isn't. He's saying, well, it's the people from before. Only the people that had their property rights taken away in the 1800s and up to the 1960s. So black Nigerians are not a part of that. Those blacks are not being discriminated against. So it's only the people with the ancestors in America. It doesn't matter how poor the Nigerians are or the Chinese are. It's only the American ancestors. So there are only two ways that these disparities could be explained. These destitute Nigerians are either bringing over hidden wealth or evil white racists are ignoring all of the black and Asian immigrants and only discriminating against people whose family have been here for over 60 years. So what about the Malays discriminating against the Indians and the Chinese? They had their property rights infringed on. Also, Indians and Asians in multiple countries in Africa. Why are they still doing so much better there? How about the Armenians in the Middle East? Why did they do so much better than everyone else, even after their property rights were completely stripped away by the Ottomans? Much worse than ever happened to free blacks in the US. How about the Jews, like literally all throughout the Middle Ages in multiple major European countries, whose property rights were stripped from them and often they were just killed? So he thinks we should help minorities escape systemic racism.
We need to stop telling the people down in the hole to just climb out and join the rest of us. No, man. The people in the hole need a ladder, need a rope, something to help them.
But I don't know, man. How are we going to do that if you can't even name a culprit? Remember you said the laws are fine and then totally backtracked and said that they weren't actually fine because of the drug laws and I don't know. Who is going to be held accountable? Because if it's not the government, then it's the people, right? The systems are made by the people and they're the ones who run it. So what do? Affirmative action hasn't worked. There's no evidence whatsoever that reparations or wealth redistribution will work. It'll probably piss everyone off though. Anyways, when has handing out tons of money and resources to people helped them? Look at foreign aid programs in developing countries all over the world. Show me a universal basic income trial that didn't manicure its recipients to guarantee its success. That's probably the most frustrating thing about this video. He says racism is the problem, but only institutional racism, but not the laws, but also not current racism, but old racism. And not only old racism, but specifically old property rights violations that haven't happened since before the Civil Rights Act. Then he says this near the end of the video, which makes it even more confusing.
Many are poor not because they are lazy, not because they are addicted to drugs, not because they don't value education. They're poor because they can't escape the history of their ancestors. I think we should help them escape it.
You can tell he's having a hard time getting this point out. It really is pretty ridiculous. He just doesn't offer any evidence for why they can't escape the history. Is it white people who won't let them escape the history? Is it themselves? Who's keeping them there? I assume the tactic here is that if you never specify, you're technically never wrong. If you keep moving the goalpost and you keep making it more and more confusing about who's truly being discriminated against, or if there truly is widespread systemic racism, then you'll just never be wrong. So back to what he said, people aren't poor because of the things that they do. They're poor because of history. Look, I'm not trying to say that history plays no part in the way people act. But what it seems like to me is he's trying to say that the culture is the way it is because of the history of discrimination. Which, look, yeah, maybe. But this entire time he's been saying it's not because of culture. So this is just really confusing. Naming off these personality traits next to the perceived problem is kind of insinuating that the problem is actually a personality trait or a cultural trait. However, to quote-unquote escape the history of their ancestors is so incredibly vague, he could really mean anything. Don't get me wrong, I understand that there is a history and we know the history, but when he's saying it in context to today and how it relates to how we can help them, it is entirely unclear. Anyways, the main issue is, how do you fix this? More of the same regulations and government programs that have made the issues worse? I have a sneaking suspicion that that's not going to work. Maybe from the decades of evidence. Alright, that's everything. Check out my sources in the description, and if you haven't seen the other video on why affirmative action failed, go check it out. Feel free to leave a like, subscribe, or help us out with a tip to our Ko-Fi or PayPal. If you're a creator struggling to make content, check out Danksphere in the link in the description, a production meets marketing company that helps creators turn their stories into content that grows their audience and business. And of course, stay free.